If you have a true scary story you want to send in to the channel, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. This happened several years ago when my wife and I had a party at our home. We had just moved into our new home in a nice suburban neighborhood, and we were eager to meet our neighbors and make some new friends. So, we decided we would splurge a bit and host a barbecue for our neighborhood to get to know everyone. I was going to do the cooking with all the meats and the kebabs. My wife would be making the side dishes and preparing the drinks. We even set up a small area for kids to play in with a slip and slide and sprinkler, things like that. It was summer and it was hot, so I knew that people could appreciate a way to cool off, maybe. We made up some pretty little cards with the basic details of the address, date, and time, and we walked door to door one weekend to hand them out and introduce ourselves. Most people answered the door, and there seemed to be a decent variety of people, from some close to our age, some with kids, some seniors, but they all seemed receptive to the idea of a party with free food. However, there was one thing that came up quite frequently when we were going door to door that intrigued us. Multiple people asked us if we were inviting Kirk. Obviously, we had just moved in, so I didn't know who Kirk was or a thing about them. I would just shrug or tell them that I probably did or will if they were within the block. Some would look around, almost like they were contemplating something at first, but then they would agree to come or thank us and let us know later, which was fine. We gave them our phone number and an email so they could RSVP to give us a better head count. It was odd to us that we had multiple people asking about this Kirk person, but we didn't know who he was. Some folks introduced themselves, others didn't, and some didn't even answer the door, so we had to leave the card. I couldn't recall talking to anyone named Kirk, though, so I had no idea who he was. However, we were both curious as to who this person was, and that made several people ask whether or not he was coming. We continued to prep for our upcoming cookout, and to our surprise, most people did actually RSVP. We were prepared to accommodate a lot of people, but I was honestly surprised by how many were actually going to show up. You know how it goes. You invite 30 people, 20 RSVP, and only 10 show up. But we practically had everyone confirmed that they would be there, so we were expecting a lot of guests. Going to the day of the party, everything was looking great. We had everything we needed, everything was set up, and I had begun cooking as our guests began to arrive. But again, as people showed up, we were asked if Kirk was there or if he was invited. I just remember the look on one woman's face, looking concerned as she asked. Again, I wasn't familiar with Kirk, so I just said yes if he lived nearby. She looked disappointed, but was trying to be pleasant. She just said that he could be a bit much at times, and then walked away afterwards to talk to some others nearby. I didn't understand. Why were so many people concerned about this Kirk? I know this is probably wrong of me, but my first thought was that he was just different. The neighborhood was in a pretty upscale area, and I think that I just assumed maybe Kirk wasn't quite on their level and was singled out. I was never that kind of person, especially coming from a family that had very little. I had to work very hard to get where I was, and I hated people who judged others so harshly because of how much money they made or the clothes that they wore. I wanted to get to know all of my neighbors, no matter who they were, and them all pointing out Kirk only made me want to get to know him more. So, I was hoping that he would show up too. I just let it go and continued to enjoy the party and get to know everyone. The kids were loving the sprinklers and slip and slide. Several people brought extra sides, desserts, and snacks, and some even brought housewarming gifts. I was grilling like crazy and only had one critic, an 8-year-old boy who thought the hot dog was too chewy, so I thought I did pretty well. As the evening went on, people came and went, so it was normal for me to miss people. I had been sitting in my lawn chair, talking and listening to those around me when I noticed a man standing by the large oak tree in our yard. He was watching the kids and would throw his head back sometimes as if he was laughing. I assumed he was one of the parents, but I couldn't recall ever having spoken to him, so I thought now was the time. I walked up to him and said hi, introducing myself. He shook my hand, but I noticed he didn't tell me his name. I asked him which one of the kids was his, but he didn't answer. Instead, he slowly looked back at me, smiling, and said, "You have a lovely family, Diego. You must be pretty grateful for them." Up until he talked, he seemed completely normal. He was wearing swim trunks and a dark blue tank top. He had short, shaggy-looking hair and a short mustache. Pretty normal looking in my opinion, but the way he said that was kind of hair-raising. It was soft and monotone. And then he looked at me and smiled, and then back to the kids. I didn't really know how to respond at first, but when I did finally speak, I said that we didn't have any kids and that these were some of the neighbors' kids. He didn't respond to that. Wanting to get out of the conversation, but not be rude, I just told him to help himself to any of the food and drinks at the table and walked back to my seat. When I went back to my seat, I kept watching the man. After watching the kids for some time, he walked away and looked at the trees in our yard. It wiggled our fence as if he was trying to test how sturdy it was, and even stared at our house with his hands on his hips while nodding. It was like he was taking it all in and seemed proud. Or impressed, maybe? I noticed several neighbors looking over at the man, and even saw one woman nodding in his direction and the others looking at him. Based on their looks and the fact that he didn't introduce himself, I assumed this must have been Kirk. Maybe he didn't tell me his name in fear that I would make him leave or judge him due to the others. My first interaction with him was certainly unconventional, but I didn't think he was a bad guy because of it. Maybe he could just use some more friends. Who knows? I just pointed him out to my wife and asked if she knew who it was. She shrugged and said that she didn't, so I told her my thoughts as well, but otherwise we left it alone. But then, shortly after him looking over our place, he approached the food table and grabbed a plate. I was hopeful that he would get something to eat and maybe come over and talk with us so we could get to know each other and hopefully confirm who he was. I watched him grab some potato salad and chips, but I had to do a double take when he looked over the meat. I had a platter with a lid covering it, but then behind it, I also had a plastic container with the other uncooked meats. I had stopped grilling so I could eat and keep the rest in the container ready to cook more if we ran low. The man lifted the lid on the cooked meat container and then put it down, and then opened the container of raw meat. I watched as he smiled and pulled out 2 raw hamburger patties and one of the steaks and put them on his plate. Then he walked away and paused on the steps to our home. He then proceeded to eat it all with his bare hands. The potato salad, the chips, and yes, the raw meat. I elbowed my wife to get her attention and pointed him out. We both looked on confused, quite frankly a little grossed out. The blood was running down his chin and arm as he ripped apart the small steak. I know people like steaks rare, but that thing was completely raw. Why eat that when there was plenty of cooked meat? Other people noticed too, and soon after, multiple people were watching. Again, I tried to ignore it. He wasn't harming anyone anyways, and I didn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. Several hours later, that man was still lingering around, but otherwise people were starting to make the exit. We made several connections and some friends we see regularly to this day. All in all, it seemed like a pretty successful party. As we started picking up, my wife pointed out the man again to me. He was now crouching down, almost as if trying to make eye contact with my wife's garden gnomes and talking to them. He was scooping up fistfuls of dirt and licking it off of his hands, and the conversation was becoming very animated. He was talking with his hands, laughing and gesturing wildly. Again, very odd, but I didn't think he was creepy or worth outcasting. My wife, however, was starting to become uncomfortable. The party was wrapping up anyways, so I thought I would walk up to him to try to wrap things up in an effort to get him to leave. When I approached him, I thanked him for coming and said that I hoped that he'd enjoyed himself. He quickly stood up and brushed off his hands, and without acknowledging me, he asked to meet my wife. I called out for her and told her he just wanted to meet her, and she reluctantly agreed. As we approached, she held out her hand to shake his, but instead, he touched her stomach and said, "If you guys don't want it, I'll take it." We both looked at each other and back at him, and my wife immediately backed up. I laughed, not knowing what to make of this conversation, and I told him thanks for coming and that we were going to clean up and call it a night. He nodded and thanked me and walked towards the gate. Right before leaving, he hollered out that he would be back for seconds, and then left, walking down the sidewalk. Once out of sight, my wife and I had a moment to say what the hell was that about, and she expressed how he didn't make her feel good at all. We then walked back to the table to finish up where one of the last couples were waiting for us to return. They looked at us curiously, and I assumed that they would know more than us, so I just asked. "So, that's Kirk, yeah?" They looked at me confused and denied it, saying that that wasn't Kirk. In fact, they didn't see Kirk at the party at all. They also explained that Kirk just drank too much and was a pretty mean drunk, and that's why a lot of people didn't invite him to things like this anymore. They told us a story about how he almost caught someone's house on fire, stole one of the neighbor's kids' bikes, and started a fight with someone else, so they all just avoided him. They thought that man was one of our friends, and that's why nobody had said anything about his odd behavior. So, in the end, Kirk never showed up, but this strange, unidentified man did, and we have no idea who he is. Talking with the neighbors, we were able to put a name to all the houses that we invited, so we couldn't even place him. Where did he even come from? After they left and we were back in our home alone, we started thinking it over even more. What did he mean by his comment he made to my wife? I joked that she wasn't telling me about being pregnant, and she also laughed and denied it vehemently. And no, over the next few months, we never had a pregnancy surprise either, so we really don't know why he said that. So, I guess there's the story of our strange neighbor, or I suppose he was just a stranger. I unfortunately don't know because we have never seen him since. But at this point, I feel like I would have much rather dealt with this Kirk guy over him. Every year, my family hosted a pretty big Independence Day barbecue. We always had a ton of relatives over from grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. I feel like it was bigger than our Christmas get-together, but I have no idea why. I was the youngest of 5 kids, and we had a pretty big house, including an in-ground pool. It'll be important to the story. The 4th of July, however, was not my favorite holiday. I was never really a fan of the fireworks, and in fact, I was kind of scared of them. I didn't like any of the stuff that went high in the air, afraid that it would fall back down and hit me. I didn't like the ones that were loud for obvious reasons, and I refused to do anything that you held. I liked very few fireworks, and sometimes it was a sensory overload, and I would just go back to my room to calm down. For the most part, people understood and left me alone. And in fact, I would have a sibling or cousin come check on me and stay to keep me company. That was always nice. But one thing we could always count on was my Uncle Pat. He was the epitome of a patriotic American, I guess. He always had on some flag-colored swim trunks and a matching shirt and hat. He probably spent way too much on fireworks, but he always made sure all of us kids had enough to shoot off. He also always bought the big and loud stuff that I don't like. I would watch those from inside or under the porch awning so I wouldn't get hit by anything. The thing about Uncle Pat was that he could never party without alcohol, and he drank a lot of it. Thankfully, I always saw my Aunt Ruth driving because I'm sure that he would probably start at home. But the problem with this was that he didn't seem to know how to control his intake, and if anyone tried to get him to slow down on the drinking or stop him from doing anything, he would get defensive. He was never physical with anyone, and I truly believe that from knowing him, but he would get loud. Yelling was not out of the realm of possibility when he got too drunk and upset. And I think my family just decided it was best to let him be unless it truly was something dangerous he was trying to do. Well, it was 2003, and I was 9 years old. I remember it being one of the hottest days that summer, so I'd been spending a lot of time in our pool. I thought that if I was in the water, I probably wouldn't catch fire and could go underwater to escape the loud sounds. And people were already shooting off the day stuff, like the parachutes, which were already putting me on edge, but I was managing. I would also shoot off the few things that I actually enjoyed too. And shortly after, Uncle Pat, Aunt Ruth, and my 2 cousins showed up. I was happy to see one of those cousins, Beth, because we were really close, but I also knew that that meant things were about to get hectic because of Pat. Pat immediately unloaded all of his fireworks as well as his drinks of choice for the night. He was already entertaining himself, shooting fireworks and trying to find different things that he could blow up. I just avoided him and his antics as much as possible. In the beginning, my parents and the other adults would just let him do what he wanted, as long as he wasn't hurting anyone or causing damage. As the night wore on and his bottles emptied, he started to get more daring. He loved to hold Roman candles as they went off, and my mom hated it. One of my brothers always wanted to do the same, and my mom always told him no, thankfully. So I heard my dad talking to Uncle Pat, his brother, to tell him to basically tone it down. But Pat didn't like being told what to do, even if it was by his parents or older brother. He would get mad and defensive about it, but he was never physical towards anyone, just all bark. It seemed like everyone got tired of telling him to stop, so they just gave up, which I hated, but I digress. When it got darker out, I sat on the covered patio and ate while I watched everyone else light fireworks. Uncle Pat was firing off the large mortars without warning, which was about to make me lock myself in my room, but I decided to hold off since Beth wanted to light a specific fountain. As hers was going off, I was pretty entertained by it. It didn't make any loud noises, but it was really pretty. The lights weren't blinding and they changed colors. Unfortunately, I was distracted by this, and didn't realize Uncle Pat was setting up his grand finale stunt, until everyone else made a commotion. I heard my mom use my dad's name in her angry tone, and looked to where she was pointing. It was Pat, holding a Roman candle in each hand and a sparkler behind each ear. His son, my cousin, was lighting the sparkler, and then Pat lit the Roman candles with those. A small argument ensued between my parents because it was too late to stop him, said my dad, and Mom was mad that he didn't in the first place. All we could do was watch and wait for this to be over. Then, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. One of the sparks hit Pat in the face, and he instinctually went to reach for his face. However, being as intoxicated as he was still holding the Roman candle. Right as he went to touch his face, the candle went off, and all we could see was a bright light in the silhouette of his head, and then the screaming started. I couldn't look away at first, as I heard Pat screaming. He dropped everything, and now it was on the ground and shooting everywhere. Pat now had a streak of fire down his shirt, and his screams turned into something nightmarish. I looked away, shielding my eyes, as I heard the adult shuffling to his aid and my cousin crying out for her father. And then the last thing I heard was a loud splash. I finally looked up and saw my uncle floating face down in the pool. I was terrified. I was young. Was he dead? Did I just witness someone dying? My dad got in the pool and helped him out, along with my other uncle who was there. My mom was already on the phone calling for help, and I stayed in my chair fearing the worst for my uncle. The paramedics arrived and immediately helped him on a stretcher. I heard him groaning, telling me that he was at least alive. Something told me to go see him and see what happened. I guess it was the curious child in me, but I still regret it to this day. When I got closer, he was holding something to his face, and he pulled it away for one of the paramedics to look at the damage. All I could see was a black hole where his eye should have been, red welts all over his face, and his scorched shirt down his chest. The sight still gives me nightmares. I remember hiding in my room after that. I heard people talking, but I didn't want to join them. I assumed the party was over after that, which I was actually thankful for. I didn't even want to think about fireworks after that. A bit of good news, I guess, for this story. Uncle Pat obviously lived. He came over a few weeks later wearing an eye patch. He did lose vision in his right eye, and he has a pretty big burn scar across the side of his face and chest. Apparently, he spilled some of his drink on his shirt, which is why he caught fire as well. He also seemed to learn his lesson pretty well. Pat really controlled his intake at parties after that, and I never saw him drink more than 2 beers. I guess losing your eyesight will do that to you. In the end, my uncle learned his lesson, and I never got over my fear of fireworks, especially after that night. I love my uncle, but seeing him like that, it looked like something out of a scary monster movie, and it absolutely scarred me. No pun intended. Just keep the fireworks far away from your face, friends. I have a story that happened back somewhere in the mid-90s. I think it was 94 or so, because I was like 9 or 10 at the oldest. For a slight bit of context, this happened at my Uncle Dave's place. I have 2 cousins, one that is a year older than me, also named David, but I'll call him D for the story so as to avoid confusion with his dad, and his little sister Jessica. D and Jessica's mom passed away about 2 years after Jessica was born. Dave had to raise them mostly by himself. At the time of this story, Dave had just bought a new house with a fairly decent amount of property, and they had moved in about 2 months before it takes place. He had done a good amount of work to the front of the property, but he had barely touched anything away from the house, which is important, I promise. So, this took place around Labor Day. My parents and I were invited over to Dave's house to check out the new place. He was super proud of it, and was excited to have the family over. There aren't many of us, so we're pretty tight-knit. That weekend, we all went over to Dave's house. Dave was grilling burgers and brats on his old grill, and we all got situated into our random little family niches, and we were enjoying the evening. After we were all stuffed full of food, the adults leaned into that post-meal laziness, and my cousin D started complaining about being bored. He asked his dad if we could go walk around the property. He told us that we could, but that we needed to be careful because he hadn't cleaned everything up, and he mentioned that we needed to look out for snakes. So, D and I got up to go walk, and Jessica sprung up saying that she wanted to go too. I didn't mind, but D didn't want her to. Dave told him that it was either she went or we all stayed where we were, so she went with us. We started off across the yard and toward the back of the property. After a while, we got into the area where the grass was taller and started to brush against my legs. I mentioned to Dee that we probably shouldn't go back there because of the snakes that Dave had mentioned, but Dee told me to shut up and follow him, because he wanted to check out the shed. So we of course kept going, and I finally saw what he was talking about. On the edge of the property, half hidden by overgrown bushes and some gnarly-looking trees, it was this rustic-looking little shed. The wood looked like it was untreated, but it looked resilient, so I guess it had to have been. It was pretty messed up from what I remember. The roof sagged a bit, and the exterior was rough, but as a kid it looked kind of cool and creepy. Dee walked up and lifted the latch on the door and pulled the door open, struggling to actually get it open. I had to step up and help him pull it because it kept getting stuck. Inside the shed, it was dim and dusty, and it was filled with old tools, some wooden crates, and just random junk. I remember that it smelled moldy and just kind of gross. We all walked in and were looking at the random items. Dee grabbed an old rusty saw and pretended to cut his arm off. I laughed, and we were talking about whatever kids talk about, when Jessica walked away from us to go into the back of the shed. After a few moments, we heard Jessica say, "Guys, look, what is that?" And when we looked over, we saw her on her tiptoes, jabbing the sharp part of a garden hoe at something hanging from the ceiling. It took a second to register what exactly was happening in front of us, and in that second, the garden hoe pierced the exterior shell of what we very quickly learned was a hornet's nest. A very large and very full hornet's nest. We watched it crack, and as soon as it did, a cloud of very angry hornets erupted from it. What followed was pure chaos. The hornets were swarming out, buzzing loudly and trying to get at us. We were all screaming and trying to grab the door, which Dee had pulled shut, which was just fantastic since, as I mentioned, it stuck pretty bad. Dee rammed into it, I was pushing it, and poor Jessica was behind us just screaming and swinging her arms. I could feel them stinging my arms and my back. We finally got the door to open, and we burst out of the shed and ran into the yard towards the house, yelling like maniacs. We ran towards the adults, and they all looked at us asking what had happened. Dee finally yelled out, "We got into a hornet's nest!" By this point, we were pretty much in the clear. The hornets had stopped following us, thankfully, and we were just all in pain and sobbing from all the stinging. Dave herded us toward the house, and my dad was already at the garden hose rinsing us off, trying to soothe some of the pain. My mom took Jessica inside to see how bad she'd gotten stung. She got it pretty bad on her head and face, more than Dee and I did. This was actually the day that we learned that none of us were allergic to bee stings, which I guess is the only positive to come out of this. In between ice packs and our sobbing, Uncle Dave scolded us, saying that he told us to be careful. Dee explained that he didn't know there were hornets in the shed, and that Jessica was the one that hid it, and of course Dave told him that she was younger than he was, so he was responsible. Basic parental scolding kind of stuff. It absolutely sucked, and I can still remember the level of pain that I was in. It was fairly excruciating. Thankfully, we came out mostly unscathed, minus Jessica, who ended up having a couple of scar spots on her face. They're not really noticeable, but they are there. The whole thing became known as the Hornet event in my family now, and my parents like to bring it up at family get-togethers nowadays, mostly to make fun of us. But I guess that's fair, and it's a small price to pay for that crazy event from when we were kids. So that, my friends, was this year's collection of scary cookout stories. This is the second collection like this I've done. I did a 4th of July stories before, but I started looking more for Cookout stories after, I think, the second time I did those. Mostly to keep it, more open for other people who don't live in the US or celebrate 4th of July. So yeah. Cookouts just seems to be more of an appropriate topic. It's more open, less pigeonholed, easier to find stories that happened during cookouts, during cookouts, in Kirkout, whatever. In Kirkouts, apparently. Kirk didn't show up, though. Anyways, cookout stories. Stories that happen during cookouts. Yeah. Today is Saturday. The day this video goes up is Saturday, I guess I should say more appropriately, the 6th, which is 2 days after the 4th. So hopefully, if you celebrate the 4th of July, you all had a fantastic one. I'm sure I did. Don't know what I'm doing, don't know what I did. But Future Raven is saying, hey, you better have had a good 4th of July, bro. Future Raven, which is in the 4th, is saying to further Future Raven that you had a good 4th. What am I saying here? Anyways, hopefully you all had a good 4th if you celebrate it. If not, hopefully you all had a fantastic week and have a good weekend. Hope I see you again here very soon. Not quite ready to wrap this up yet. But if you enjoyed the stories, consider hitting the like button on the video. That helps tremendously. You can also subscribe to the channel if you're new and liked what you heard and want more stories like this. I do content frequently. July is content-heavy month. We are going to be doing a ton of stuff. Look out for notifications from me probably every day this month after this. So, yeah. You can also leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts. How you're doing, how your week went, how your 4th was if you celebrated, so forth and so on. You can also super thanks, which is a tip to the channel. Join Patreon or memberships, get early access to content like this and other content, depending on how you're feeling and what you wouldn't sign up for. Just that. Or go to astheravendreams.com if you have a story to submit. You can do that too. Yeah. Now, all that said, friends, hope you have a beautiful day and a beautiful rest of your week. Hope I see you again here very soon, tomorrow. And I hope that, you know that you are important, that you are loved, that you are valid, that you are the best you that you can be. Don't forget it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And until I see you again, my beautiful friends, much love and sleep well.